Hey class, so today we're going to talk about Augustine of Hippo and his text, The City of God, in particular, Book 8, chapters 1 through 5. And what I'm going to do is give you first a brief background of Augustine of Hippo, who he is and what is he about, then the context of his writing this book, The City of God, and then finally I'll talk about how that relates to the reading today. And Augustine of Hippo is probably more widely known as, Saint Augustine, and he's one of the major figures in the development of the Latin Church. So Augustine of Hippo was born in North Africa in Numidia in 354 AD, and he died in the city of Hippo, also in North Africa, in 430 AD. He spent, not surprisingly to say, most of his life in Africa, but there is a brief yet important sojourn into Italy that is recounted in his autobiographical text, The Confessions. Augustine was a brilliant young man, and this was during the time of the Roman Empire. So to make his fortune, he left Africa and went to Italy to work as a teacher and practitioner of the rhetorical arts. He would give speeches, teach people how to speak persuasively, and things like this. And during this time, he sort of had a religious philosophical crisis, the resolution of which was Augustine's decision to be baptized a Christian. And shortly thereafter, his mother joined him, coming over from Africa, and they decided that they would return, they would leave Italy, and sort of his secular strivings. His mother, Monica, dies before they get back, but upon his return to Africa, he is ordained a priest, and then shortly thereafter a bishop, and he becomes his see, where the city where he is bishop is Hippo, whence his name, Augustine of Hippo. And it's in his time as bishop that he does most of his philosophical and theological writings, and he is one of the most influential Latin writers. Augustine wrote in Latin, and the history of philosophy and theology would be different if Augustine didn't write. So the text that we're going to look at is The City of God, and that's actually an abbreviation of the title. The full title is The City of God Against the Pagans. And so Augustine begins the section that we're reading by distinguishing between three different kinds of theology: the civil theology, fabulous theology, and natural theology. The civil theology is the theology of the city, right? It's the stories that ancient cities would tell themselves about the gods and their relationship to the gods and the role the gods play in the founding and maintenance of the city. And although I said that it's something that ancient cities would do, it's also arguably something that modern cities would do, or contemporary societies and cultures do. And in the same way, ancient Greece and ancient Rome had their own civil theologies, as in the story of the Pan-Athenian festival that Socrates references in the Euthyphro, and the reference to the gods of the city in the Apology, right? These are all elements of civil theology. Then you also have fabulous theology. This would be the theology that's contained in fables or in myths. These don't necessarily have anything to do with a city per se. They might just be the story of some, hero like Perseus, but still serve to say something about the relationship between gods and the world. And then finally, you have the natural theology. Natural theology is the theology of the philosophers. That it's a theology that the philosophers develop in their speculations about the nature of the universe and the world and life and things like that. Now, why does Augustine follow Varro in distinguishing between these three different theologies? Well, because normally we jumble them all up, and we just think it's all people talking about God or gods. And Augustine is going to want to say that these are actually three different ways, three different sort of discourses about God, and they're not all the same, and it's possible to be against some of them without being against all of them. So when it comes to the civil theology, Augustine of Hippo has no use for that, nor does he think that the fabulous theology of the myths and legends are believable or important. But he does think that natural theology is important. So what does that mean? Well, Augustine is very much a critic of civil theology. Like, not surprisingly, he doesn't believe the ancient Greek myths about Athena, Zeus, and people like that, right? I mean, he'd be a pretty terrible bishop if he was worshiping the Olympian gods. But he also, if you read other parts of the City of God, he also doesn't have much use for certain Christian civil theologies. There's a guy by the name of Eusebius who was a very sort of influential thinker from a couple generations before Augustine, who created sort of like this Christian civil theology that had, emperors Constantine and people like that sort of playing this providential role in world history, and things are just going to keep getting better and better now that the empire has become de facto Christian. And Augustine thinks that's nonsense. He doesn't think that things are going to keep getting better and better, and he doesn't think that we should theologize our politics. Now, so Augustine is going to not have much use, therefore, for civil theology, nor is he going to have much use, therefore, for the fabulous theology, the theology of the fables. He does, however, think that civil theology is interesting because the existence of it tells us something about the functioning of societies and how societies organize themselves, which is to say that the fact that there is civil theology tells Augustine that societies need to tell themselves stories about the gods. And you can take the gods in a broad sense here, right? Societies need to tell themselves stories about the divine. They need to, or you might say more generally, they need to have some kind of meta-narrative that holds a society together. And that meta-narrative is basically a civil theology. And it doesn't even have to have the gods in it, right? So the civil theology doesn't even have to be about religion, right? You could have a civil theology of progress. One of the great discussions in contemporary philosophy, and one of the great debates in the last, let's say, 40 years, is over how many or how much of our modern social and political concepts are not really theologies that won't use the name, right? So there's been this huge discussion of whether or not the sort of the structure of how we think about politics and economics and societies and things that we think of as sort of like purely secular and based on pure reason are not in fact masking unspoken theologies. And if so, what are those unspoken theologies? Are they actually heresies of some kind? And things like this. It's a very interesting and acrimonious debate that, right, if you're interested in it, there's, it sort of all starts with a German philosopher, as, so many things do, named Karl Leuwith, and then he'd be sort of responded to by Hans Blumenberg, and then there's a longer debate where one could mention names like John Milbank, Slavoj Žižek, Giorgio Agamben, and numerous others trying to also chime in on this. But the basic question goes all the way back to at least Augustine and the City of God, and this discussion of civil theology, and the idea that whether they admit it or not, all societies are sort of organized along civil theological lines. And If so, what do we make of that, and so on and so forth. But Augustine will, again, he's critical of civil theology in the sense that he thinks that civil theologies, whether pagan or Christian, can often tend to just legitimize the status quo, which is really what they're for, right? What they're for is to sort of lend a transcendental or transcendent foundation for whatever particular social or political structure is in place. It's important to understand Augustine is not against the theological interpretation of one's contemporary society or anything like that, but he thinks that theological interpretation of a contemporary society should usually take the form of a sort of a prophetic critique of that society's shortcomings and its failures to live up to what is, required of it, rather than, as civil theology does, sort of a theological cheerleading for that society. Augustine doesn't like civil theology insofar as he doesn't like theological cheerleading, but he's certainly in favor of sort of theologically informed critiques of one society. But that's not what we're going to talk about. In book 8, chapters 1 through 5, he wants to talk about natural theology. He says, of these, as far as we're inheriting them from the ancient world, the fabulous theology and the civil theology are basically nonsense, right? Zeus is nonsense. Athena, nonsense. Heracles, nonsense, right? But Plato is not nonsense. And the theology that we find in Plato, the discourse on the gods or on divinity that we find in Plato, that is not nonsense, right? So when Socrates is talking about his daimon, his sort of divine spirit in the Apology that tells him what to do and what not to do, that Augustine thinks is not nonsense. That we have to take seriously. And so what he'll do in these chapters of the City of God is take a deep dive into Socrates and Plato. One of the things that we'll see Augustine do is explain that, Socrates didn't come out of nowhere. He had teachers and predecessors. And also he'll speculate or talk about Plato's travels after he had left after the death of Socrates. Here we have, references to Plato visiting the Egyptians or visiting Sicily and the Pythagoreans, and some things that I mentioned in earlier videos. The upshot of Augustine's discussion of Platonism is going to be this, that as far as Augustine is concerned, what the philosopher is looking after, right? The philosopher is literally philosophia. The philosopher is the lover of wisdom. The philosopher wants to know the truth. They want to have a deep understanding of the basic structure of the universe and live their life in accordance with an understanding of that basic structure of the universe. And insofar as that is the case, and Augustine is going to add, insofar as God is that truth and that basic structure and things like that, then the philosopher, whether they know it or not, is actually seeking God, right? So part of what Augustine does in this part of the text is he argues that the Platonic philosopher, at least, is seeking God. The Platonic philosopher, their quest for wisdom, their quest for knowledge, is actually a quest for God. And so philosophy and religion are not antagonistic in the way that it might seem in, say, the reading of Plato. Or another way to put this is, yes, philosophy is going to be antagonistic towards civil theology, right? And we see Socrates, doing that in the Euthyphro and the Apology and things like that. And yes, philosophy is going to be antagonistic towards the fabulous theology. And we see Socrates' criticisms of, the Greek myths also in the Euthyphro. But that doesn't mean, Augustine will argue, that philosophy is going to be antagonistic towards all religious beliefs. So Augustine is going to maintain that insofar as one believes in sort of one God who is the creator and sustainer of the universe, and that one God is going to be the object of the philosopher's quest, so that the philosopher and the religious believer are essentially on the same team. The one thing that Augustine will add is that the religious believer, in a certain sense, not in every sense, but at least in a certain sense, has what the philosopher is seeking after. So, take, for example, I mentioned his mother, Monica, at the beginning of this video. His mother, Monica, by all accounts, was not highly educated. But in the Confessions, he recounts her having this mystical vision of some sort. Now, he would say that, in a sense, she achieved through faith what the philosopher is trying to achieve through rational argumentation. So there's a sense in which Augustine's going to want to say that the believer, through faith, can actually fulfill what the philosopher is seeking. And so ultimately for him, religion is not the opponent of philosophy, but properly understood, religion is the fulfillment of philosophy. And so that Socrates, in Augustine's reading of him, becomes a kind of a friend of true religion and a critic of false religion. And so with that, I'll let you go, and in the next video I make, we'll talk about Al-Kindi.